My name is Christopher Malone, and I'm the curator at the American Swedish Historical Museum, and it is my pleasure to introduce Agnès Trouillet. She is the Associate Professor of American Studies at the University of Paris, Nanterre. Her research interest is in European and indigenous clashing concepts and representations of space and territory and their impact on sovereignty. She focuses on the Mid-Atlantic region, notably in the role of William Penn's settlement design in reshaping the Delaware River Valley. She has published in the Transactions of the American Philosophical Society on the boundary dispute between Maryland and Pennsylvania, and in French journals on colonial mapping used as a strategy and instrument to erase indigenous populations. She will present on Wingehácking, choice land for planting or cultivating a favorite spot, using countercartography to reinstate Lenape presence on 17th century European maps of the Delaware River Valley. Please join me in welcoming Agnès Trouillet.
Thank you very much for having me today. It's an honor to be speaking at the New Sweden History Conference, and I'm privileged that you trusted my work enough, and I wanted to thank all the organizers of this beautiful event. Talking after the fascinating keynote and the two beautiful presentations of my colleagues, I hope this presentation will interest you, although I'm far from being an expert on New Sweden, actually, or on Lenape culture yet. And I also wanted to acknowledge that we are talking today in Philadelphia, which sits on the original homeland of the Lenape, Wingehácking. Even for the people in the audience who are not experts in linguistics, it's helpful to know that ing or ink is a locative suffix in the Lenape language. So often for the words ending in ing or ink, you know that they will mean at someplace or where something happened. And you will be able to reconstruct the meaning of the word by knowing what the stem of the word means. As seminal studies on the region have demonstrated, notably by historians Dan Richter, Jean Sutherland, and Professor Thompson, 17th century Delaware River Valley was dynamic with exchanges between the Lenape, the original inhabitants, or Delaware Indians, and the Dutch, Swedes, Finns, and English, who had settled the region before Quaker William Penn was granted his charter in 1681. The Lenape dictated their conditions to the Europeans, not the contrary, and were able to maintain their territorial sovereignty. And now we know a little more about what we need to learn about sovereignty. The Swedes notably developed successful relationships with the Lenape based on trade and mutual exchange rather than aggressive land acquisition, which allowed both peoples to coexist rather harmoniously for several decades. Penn's colony shifted this delicate balance. This was due to the massive influx of immigrants, as historians have long appreciated, but also to the implementation of a specific settlement design. Penn's famous gridiron was implemented using new European mapping techniques relying on Euclidean geometry and property survey, at complete odds with the Lenape conception of landscape and territory. Indigenous people viewed territory as the lands shared between several communities, whether nations, groups, or tribes, or with Europeans, whether for hunting or for agriculture, between them and with the Europeans for other purposes. Land cannot be owned by a single individual and can never be owned in perpetuity, which is the very object of European individual property. Understanding the indigenous and European antagonistic conceptions of landscape and territory helps to make sense of this encounter, or rather confrontation. And here the role of cartography also needs to be taken into account as one of the instruments which allowed the progressive erasure of the indigenous populations from the region. Indeed, from the 17th century, cartography became the main instrument of division. Maps implemented linear boundaries between different territories with centralized authorities prevailing within them. Maps not only represented the world along geometrical references anymore, they also started to define its visual representation as the forms of authority that ceases to be represented on the map progressively disappeared from settlers' imagination, as Jordan Branch states in the cartographic state, here referenced. Hence, the crucial role of cartography in colonial endeavors. The New World offering empires a means to project their ambitions on a largely unknown geography, which colonial powers understood as an empty space. Royal charters used lines of latitude to mark colonies' borders and left colonists to make sense of these divisions locally, as Max Delson explains in the new map of empire, here referenced. So 17th, then 18th century cartographic representations evacuated the indigenous presence by literally erasing them from the map. Reinstating the entities discarded from the map is the object of countercartography, a critical approach to existing maps as products of Eurocentric cartographic conventions. By reappropriating cartographic conventions, countercartography is primarily used today to create alternative maps, counter maps. It can also be used to revisit colonial archives in an attempt at making the obscured entities visible. This is the angle I'm using here within a larger project focused on the Mid-Atlantic colonies, which attempts at reinstating indigenous agency, their conceptions and practices in the history of the region. So this presentation will try to apprehend these antagonistic conceptions by relying on two types of material, maps and textual sources from the 17th and 18th centuries. I shifted a little bit from the presentation I sent, but we will find almost everything. So 17th century maps of the Delaware Valley allow to see how the representation of the region evolved from the Swedish and the Dutch to the English. The first mentioning Indian toponymy, settlements, and even recording cultural landmarks, while on English maps of the later decades, the Lenape entities have been almost completely erased. Of course, they had different objectives. Textual sources allow to examine Lenape toponymy, place names being one of the avenues to apprehend how indigenous people conceived of and related to their landscape, their surroundings, and more largely, their sense of place in the world. So we're going to get to work on the map that is the, the background of the conference iconography. So the sources I wanted to focus on are the map here, Nova Suecia, I'm sorry for my accent, which depicts the Delaware River that the Swedes called the New Sweden River, by Peter Lindström, dated 1654-1655. Peter Lindström was a Swedish engineer sent to explore the Delaware River for its navigation and plantation potential. It is thus an exploratory map. The other source is Geographia Americae, also by Lindström. Lindström published Geographia in 1691 from the journal he kept while in the colony of New Sweden, that is to say 30 years afterwards. And if this man, who had wanderlust in his life, had not been forced to stay in bed for the last 20 years of his life because of sickness, we probably would not have access to this important material. Geographia was written in Swedish, but non-Swedish speakers are able to access this archive thanks to its translation into English, which was published in 1925 by the Swedish Colonial Society. The translation is by famous historian Amandus Johnson, whose seminal work on New Sweden is precious for scholars working on the Delaware Valley. My aim was initially to look at specific elements on Lindström's map, and to use Lenape vocabularies that had been compiled by contemporaries of Lindström and from later sources. I would look for a selection of toponyms to make sense of the indigenous conception of landscape and territory. This summer, I started a long overdue work on Geographia, and notably at the Swedish American Historical Museum, so thank you very much for welcoming me. I realized that in his English translation, historian Agnès Johnson had added at the end an appendix of what he called Indian geographical names. This appendix is actually a compilation of all the known sources on Lenape vocabulary he had at his disposal at the time. Thus, Agnès Johnson, a century ago, had already conducted the kind of ethnographical work I am interested in here, where he is trying to elucidate points of topography and local history using maps and textual sources. I am explaining this because my initial aim was not to just reuse the appendix by Johnson. Now, what I can do with this fantastic material to build up on it is, and on later compilations of Lenape vocabulary, which sometimes contradict Johnson's appendix, is to conduct more research on local history by focusing on specific localities or places. For example, to examine individual encounters and conflicts over questions of landscape and territory, and try to reconstruct what happened on the ground. This, hopefully, with the collaboration of Lenape people. Back to Lindström and his sources. Royal engineer Peter Lindström accompanied Commissioner Reising, I'm sorry for the pronunciation, Reising, who came to manage the New Sweden colony after Vice Governor Papagoja, who himself had replaced Governor Prince, after Papagoja had been relieved from his position. They arrived, Lindström and Reising, on May 23rd, 1654, and it would be only another year and a half until the colony surrendered to the Dutch on September 11, 1655. The colony was short-lived indeed and struggled in part because the mother country failed to send them provisions and goods to trade with neighboring Dutch and English merchants, as well as with indigenous trade partners, Minkas Susquehannocks and Lenape. This weakened the Swedes' position in the prevailing regional exchange network. The Lenape notably had famously gathered, as we heard this morning, in the past to discuss the fate of the Swedish colony, opting for pursuing friendship. But they exerted leverage and had no difficulty in maintaining their territorial sovereignty in that period. By the time Commissioner Reising and Lindström arrived, numerous settlers had fled to neighboring Maryland and Virginia, and others had rebelled. Therefore, Reising needed to restore order in government. Also, in 1654, they were still hopeful to exploit the potential of the colony by exploiting its natural resources, the trees, for example, the agricultural products, and by erecting mills also. Lindström's instructions were thus to explore the Delaware River for its navigation and plantation potential. However, he was neither a surveyor nor a cartographer. His expertise was the art of fortification, and he had also been sent to repair a damaged fort. He was by himself, rather young and inexperienced, and had unsophisticated instruments at his disposal. Yet he produced this remarkable map, although he had only 2 years to conduct his exploration. So this is the copy of the map that is included in a famous work by Agnès Johnson, New Swedish settlements on the Delaware. Sorry for giving you all these titles, but I wanted to use this digitized version because it's much easier than the one you saw before. It's easier to study. So the Delaware River is a major river in the mid-Atlantic region, For people in the audience who might not be familiar with the region, the river flows from the north to the south. And so Lindström's map has the north to the right, as you can see. It shows the Delaware River from Cape Henlopen to Cape Henlopen and Cape May that we see here on the left side. So from Cape Henlopen and Cape May in the Delaware Bay on the left, which corresponds to the south, up to the falls on the Delaware River near present-day Trenton on the right. Okay. So it is red, moving up along the west bank of the river, up to its falls, and then downward from the falls along the east bank back down to its mouth, the way Lindström explored it. Okay. Lindström included an index at the bottom of his map. You can see all the entries at the bottom that use letters A to Z and numbers 1 to 27. So a great number of entries corresponding to the different elements for which he lacked space on the map to write directly. It's a very, very thorough map. 2 chapters in Geographia, the journals that were published by Lindström 30 years later, actually serve to better understand the map. Chapter 4 concerns the navigation on the river, and Chapter 5, the situation and conditions of the countries of New Sweden located on both sides of the river. As was hinted at this morning, when the first settlers of New Sweden arrived in 1638, they planted on the west bank of the Delaware, where the lands had not been claimed by Europeans, which was the condition after Swedish law to make it legal to buy the lands from the Lenape. So you can make, for example, out elements such as Paradise Point, the first Swedish settlement, Trefaldiget, the fort that was taken from the Dutch, which was called Fort Casimir, which then became New Amstel when the Swedes surrendered to the Dutch in 1655, and then which became Newcastle, the actual Newcastle, when the English conquered the region in 1664. You can make out Fort Christina, the most important Swedish settlement on the site of present-day Wilmington. Uppland, also very important, and where the first court of justice was erected in the region. And Tennaconk or Tinicum, where Governor Prince had erected his residence, Princehof. You can see that the area from, if I move back here, you can see that the area from the mouth of the river up to Uppland is densely populated. Also from Uppland to Philadelphia, which was not Philadelphia at the time. So you see in the middle of the map, it's pretty settled. And if we move here, which is more to the right of the river of the map, you have the area corresponding to Philadelphia, which is Passayunk. Okay, but of course it was not settled as much then, because William Penn's colony would not start until 1681, so 2 decades and a half later. The map is characteristic for its focus on waterways. Lindström went up every tributary and creek that had its mouth on the river. It indicates the shoals, the shallows, resulting of cautious riverine soundings. Another characteristic of the map is the number of indigenous names that are used, sometimes with a Swedish spelling. But to some extent, it is reminding of John Smith's famous map that we also saw this morning from 1612, which painstakingly recorded the numerous Indian settlements of Virginia. So some landmarks are also visible, such as, this is later, but I will show it more in detail later. But on the right-hand side, you can see those dotted lines which correspond to Indian Path and there is an Indian path to Manhattan. So you have indigenous cultural landmarks present on this map. So let me now take you through a few names that might ring a bell for you. So Passayunk, that you know, and for which plaques have been installed on the pavements now to figure the former Lenape Indians, right? Passayunk is a cognate of Pasaik, Pasiasek, Pasayek, which means valley, and the locative ending ing, which means at or where, and so it means at or in the valley or in a low place. You also have Wikwakoing, which is Wikako, and there are two meanings, either at the pine tree camp house, at the pine tree camp or house, or the place where something ends. And this is interesting because Johnson compiled a number of vocabularies, and there are new meanings that are proposed today. So it's an ongoing search. Coaconoc, which is not on the map, is the name of the site where Philadelphia now stands. It means the grove of tall pine trees. You also have Assipink, which is the name of the falls on the Delaware, which means at the water on the rocks, or the waterfall at the rocks. So I chose Wingehácking. So you have them here, right? The different interpretations. So I hesitated to the name I would choose for the title of the presentation, and actually picked Wingehácking or Wingehácking, which Ecke Welder, who was a Moravian missionary who compiled an important vocabulary of the Lenape, and I'm happy to talk about that later. He proposed the interpretation choice land for planting or cultivating a favorite spot. This is important, of course, because Lindström was there to evaluate the quality of the land. It's about evaluating the plantation potential, right? So why did I choose this name? Because, well, it doesn't appear on Lindström's map, because the stream did not have its mouth on the Delaware. So he did write a number of names, but not this one. It is, well, the creek ran from present-day Mount Airy in Germantown to the place where it fell into Tacony Creek to form Frankfort Creek, for the people who are familiar with the rivers here. The name initially appeared as Wingehácking and Winconico in patents to land in the area issued between 1684 and 1701. So deeds and patents are an important source where we need to look for the meaning of those words, right? And Wingehácking Creek is part of the streams of Philadelphia that were buried and rerouted into sewer lines between 1880 and 1928. So it's a hidden creek today. It's obscure, and this is also why I chose it. Because when we are not sure about the meaning of something, this is where we need to do more research. And another meaning has been proposed. It is, and it evokes a sweet fragrance, or at the sweet land, or at the sweet-smelling plantation. And the sweet fragrance of the forests in America are often mentioned in the early Swedish records. And Lindström in Geographia said that a sick person might recover their health from the fragrance of these trees. He was talking about the spruce trees. And he evokes a more delightful and sweet fragrance than the spruce trees in Sweden. Wingehácking is also a region where there are sassafras trees, which are known for having a very nice smell, whether the bark, the leaves, or the fruits. So coming back to Lindström's way of keeping to indigenous cultural landmarks, the fact that he indicated travel from one point to the next, not in distance, but in time. For example, saying that to Senkikan proper, we can walk in about half an hour. So this is typical of the way of calculating the distance for indigenous people. He also recorded the use of canoes by the natives. But with canoes, there are boats made like hollowed out boats with us in Sweden. We can get from Senkikans to the Folesipink. Canoes actually allowed the Lenape to go wherever they pleased in some parts of the river, notably above the falls of the Delaware. So I'm insisting on this because it testifies to the role of indigenous knowledge and practices, and also to the different ways of seeing the landscape and the streams. Because of course the natives did not need to have a deep water to navigate with their canoes, which means they had a different view of this landscape and a different use of the land. This is part of the different conceptions. So I can't study other maps in detail as I had planned, but I wanted to show you, because I'm running late already, this very famous map by Augustine Ehrman from 1670, which was published in 1673 in London, which was initially commanded to settle a boundary dispute. There is a fantastic book by Christian Coote on this map that I can recommend you. Herman not only used indigenous toponyms, he also meticulously inventoried their settlement, and he showed native cultural elements. The map presents their numerous settlements, and you can make out the long houses composing their villages, right? There are many of them on the map. The name of the Schuylkill River is mentioned in Dutch, Kil meaning river in Dutch, nothing with a murderous intention, right? And you have the meaning in Lenape, Manayunk, okay? So Manayunk, which means the place where we gather to drink, or the noisy stream. So just the fact that he indicates the name of the river in two languages says a lot about his intentions and his respect for the indigenous culture. And of course, and this is the cover. Well, you have a canoe described on the left, but you have this is the cover that Gene Sutherland chose for his book about the Lenape, which shows a part of New Jersey which is at present inhabited only almost by Indians. So they were there, right? So you could say that Herman's map can be read as the last European cartographic tribute to the Lenape in the 17th century, compared to English maps of the later decades from which their presence has been completely discarded, which is the case, of course, on the famous map commanded by William Penn in 1681 to promote his province to accompany a pamphlet. The map presents the region as a white canvas, with the interior pictured as completely empty, with huge swaths of land ready to be planted, with only a few scattered trees, reassuring English investors on the promises of agriculture. There are very few Lenape names, but there is no settlement indicated. You can make out Shakamaxon, the place of the famous legendary treaty with William Penn in 1682. But the caption that stands the most out, because it contains the word Indian in full, is the Old Indian Field on the west bank of the Delaware, which makes native populations appear as extinct. Lenape names are visible, but no settlements are shown. They seem to have been tamed and absorbed by the first European settlers. This is a map that was also commanded by William Penn, that was published in 1687, and which shows the improved parts of the province of Pennsylvania, with the neat division into counties, townships, and lot by the first Surveyor General of the province, Thomas Holm. And so you see here the demonstration of the grid iron and how it imposed straight and fixed line that reshaped landscape and territory in the Delaware Valley. Indigenous presence has been completely evacuated on this map. There are no Lenape toponyms, although Holm had taken part in several transactions with the Lenape. He was well aware of their presence and would have been able to incorporate it on his map, even as scattered or marginal settlements. So you could say that both maps can be read as what historian of cartography J.B. Hawley called a declaration of exclusion for the Indian occupation of the land. I have a few concluding remarks, and I apologize because I'm 5 minutes late, so sorry for keeping you. And so I just wanted to conclude with this map titled Philadelphia Region, when known as Cohacconock Map, 1934, which I discovered in the colonial room of the Swedish American Historical Museum, and of which the Historical Society of Pennsylvania has a copy. It was commended by the Philadelphia City Planning Commission for the semi-quicentennial celebrations of the capital, and shows the Philadelphia region at the time of the colonial encounter, and painstakingly records Lenape places and toponyms. For example, Shankamakson Cohacconock, with the interpretation of these names. So among the sources mentioned for the production of the map, which are at the bottom, I didn't detail them, but you find among these sources Lindestrom's map from 1655, Lindestrom Geographia America, Herman's map from 1670, Holmes' map from 1687, as well as other famous maps and histories of the region. So the 1934 map was produced to restore the indigenous perspective. It describes in the efforts by anthropologists and ethnolinguists of the early 20th century to put the Lenape in the foreground and reinscribe the toponyms on the geography of the region. It is one of the first initiatives at producing a countercartography of the region and allows to pay tribute to its original inhabitants. Thank you very much for your attention. Wanishi.